Today's video is a tutorial on a piece of music called Mélodie from a composer called Gluck. Now this was originally for strings and flute, however it has been transcribed for piano, and even better, it's played by many world-class pianists but is still accessible to we amateurs. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anyone who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now and it's all done for you. I first came across this piece when it was YouTube, in fact, that recommended it to me in my usual video feed, and it was a performance by Yuja Wang. And since then I've heard it also played by other amazing artists such as Evgeny Kissin, even Rachmaninoff and Nelson Friera. And this piece of music is so beautiful that whilst concert pianists love to perform it as an encore, for we amateurs we can still have a go at it, and that's why I'd call it an accessible encore. Now I did actually talk about this piece briefly in my video about splitting an accompaniment between the hands. However, I thought it was so gorgeous that it was really worth doing a full tutorial for those of you who'd like to have a go at learning it. As I said, the original was for flute and strings, and the transcription that I'm using was by Sgambati, which you can find on IMSLP, and the link's below for you. As always, let's look first at the structure. And I say this because I think it's useful to look at a piece from beginning to end first to get an idea of how it flows, where the climax is and all of those kind of things. And then when we practice it, we might choose to practice it differently. It's in D minor and a lento 3/4 time. It's equally marked molto espressivo. It's fairly short, the score taking 3 pages for its 38 measures. The way I've subdivided this for myself is in 2 main sections, which are linked by a bridge and then followed by a short ending. First we have measures 1 to 6, the first section. Then the bridge in measures 17 to 20. And then the second section, which is measures 21 to 35, followed by a 3-measure ending. Interestingly, the second section itself is actually just 7 measures, which are repeated almost note for note, so that gives us a little less to learn. The piece builds to a gradual climax in measure 23, and then slowly fades back to finish at pianissimo. Musically, we have a melody line that in the original is played by the flute, a 16th note accompaniment, in the original played on strings, and a bass line. As we can see in the notation, Sgambati intends us to split this 16th note accompaniment pattern between the hands and spread the notes between the bass and treble clefs. Another feature that is worth taking note of is that in almost every instance, the top note of the second and third of the 16th notes is the same. Although as it's written on a different stave frequently, it isn't always immediately obvious straight away, or at least it wasn't to me. And we'll make use of this pattern as we work through the piece. For myself, I actually decided to memorize this as I was learning it. And that's simply because the notation isn't always super easy to read because of the way the accompaniment gets split between the hands. And also the left hand does move around a fair bit, so it's useful to be able to keep an eye on it, so to speak. However, whether you choose to memorize or not is up to you, but I do invite you to listen carefully to the tiny details that I've tried to pull out from the score, as these will greatly help you as signposts while you're learning it. I highly recommend we spend some time really thinking about the patterns being used here. We'll notice there are 2 main patterns, with the odd exception that proves the rule, so to speak. And this will be invaluable for our memorization. From the opening measures, focusing in on the 16th note accompaniment, we can see that in 3 of the first 4 measures, Sgambati opts for a single note on the second of each set of 16th notes. And so I highlighted this in pink as a quick reinforcement. He mostly notates a division between the hands whereby the second note of the set is played in the right hand, often with the thumb. Now measure 2 is an exception where Gluck switched the strings from playing a chord-based accompaniment to a scale-based one. As we can see by the pedal markings and the rests, we don't necessarily need to hold down this top C sharp for the full value, as the pedal will in fact take care of that. Depending on the size of your hands, releasing the C sharp might be helpful for you to be able to keep the scale notes nice and soft. Then the following 2 measures revert to our original pattern. I also recommend we practice this in fairly small segments, and so given this similarity in the pattern, let's take this as the first practice segment we're going to use. If we now look at measures 5 to 8, Sgambati changes the pattern by using a dyad rather than a single note for the second of the 16th note set. However, notes that he respects his rule of repeating the top note of the second and third sets. And also note that the way he notates the split is that the right hand still takes the higher of the dyad, but the left hand will take the lower notes. So here I've used a yellow line highlight to reinforce this change in pattern while I'm first learning. You might notice that in a couple of places he suggests keeping the entire set of 16th notes in the left hand, which makes a lot of ergonomic sense. It's perhaps worth pointing out in the D minor scale at the end of measure 8 that my score recommends using 4 sets of 4, with each using the thumb on the first set. This suggests that we might actually want to hear this ever so slightly. I use measures 5 to 8, well actually to the first note of measure 9, as my second practice segment. I found that working on small sections like this in isolation really actually helps to get it under the fingers, and I'd recommend that you stick to maybe the first 2 segments whilst you really get a feel for the way he uses this pattern with the split of the accompaniment between the hands. And bringing out all of these tiny details as I've just done here about whether it's a dyad or a single note might sound a little pedantic, but you'll be surprised just how helpful it is once you actually start trying to play from memory. If you do find this works for you, please do let me know in the comments. Next, let's look at measures 9 to 12. And again, first we'll spend some time analysing the patterns and highlighting the different ones using yellow and pink highlights. Note that in measure 11, we actually have 2 different types of ornaments. We have the appoggiatura on the first 2 beats, with an acciaccatura on the third. So this means the first 2 should be played much more slowly, and the third somewhat faster. The pickup in measure 13 brings us to a particularly beautiful part of the piece, and also gives us an exception that proves the rule about the top note. We can see that here in the 16th note accompaniment, it departs from its usual top note feature in that the top note of the second and the third of the 16th notes is not the same this time. And we see this feature again in measure 13. However, elsewhere it sticks with the same pattern we used before. In measure 15, we also have a helpful memorization aid in that the 8th note melody note is 1 octave above the lower of the first of the 16th notes. This is in addition to the middle 2 having the same top note. Another handy tip to help with memorization is to take note of the different intervals used. We can see that often the interval between the top note of a set and the bottom is actually an octave. In other places, it's not. Keeping this in mind as we work through in small segments really helps the notes to sink into our memory. And then now we're ready to move into what I've called the bridge as we get into measure 16. To me, the bridge really starts to add to the drama of this piece and is introduced with a descending bass line. And this idea also repeats in measure 18. I think it's worth practicing this, trying to actually bring out this feature by voicing the lower note more strongly. Aside applying the extra weight to the pinky to bring out that lower note, we can also focus our attention on the second note of the 16th notes to keep this especially light so that it doesn't compete with that bass note. And this takes us from piano in measure 16 to mezzo forte in measure 17, so we can really afford to exaggerate the bass here, I think. Now in measures 17 and 19, I opted not to split between the hands and sgambati notates. It would involve the right hand jumping more than an octave in the space of 1/16th note, and given that the other 16th notes fit well enough under the left hand, I opted to use my thumb on the top note of both of them here. As I explained in my video about splitting things between the hands, we're often under no obligation to follow the split that's given in the score, and if it doesn't suit our hands very well, there's no need not to change it, providing musically it sounds the same. This then now brings us nicely to the second section. And as I said, it's basically 7 measures that are repeated. So once we've learned the first set of 7, we can pretty much play from measures 21 to 35. To practice this, I further subdivided it into 2 smaller segments. I considered one segment as the last beat of measure 20 to the first beat of measure 25. And then the second segment as measure 25 from the first beat to the first beat of measure 28. Starting from the last beat of measure 20, again, we can see the pattern of the top note of the middle pair of 16th notes is the same everywhere, except in the second beat of measure 22, where in fact the melody takes that particular note, so repeating it in the pattern would disturb it too much, I think. It's worth noting that the first note of the 16th note pattern in the first 2 beats of measure 21 is notated in the right hand rather than the left, as is more common elsewhere. Again, a useful little detail to help our memory. Measure 23 departs from the usual accompaniment pattern by using a chord on the offbeats. Note also that the B flat of the final one is notated in the left hand rather than the right. Next we have measure 24. This doesn't use the same pattern as elsewhere. Rather, the 16th notes are actually scale-based, first in sixths, then in thirds, similar to what we found in measure 2 in fact. However, here I opted for a slightly different fingering strategy. In the score I have, it is suggested that the thumb be used multiple times for consecutive notes, so the pinky can hold down the top note. And this is perfectly workable, but ever so slightly stretchy. However, if we look at the pedal marking, the intention is that the pedal is held for the full value of that C sharp. Of course, that gives much stronger resonance to the note within the piano, which means that in fact, we don't need to actually hold it down with our finger. And I went into this principle in more detail in my video on legato fingering. You might prefer to simply not hold that note so you don't need to keep repeating the thumb, as this makes controlling those quieter 16th notes somewhat easier. Here's the solution I opted for, taking the last 3 16th notes of the set, all in my left hand in fact. Now for measures 33 to 35, let's re-examine the pattern. The first beat of measure 33 is actually another of those exceptions that proves the rule. Here again is one of the few places in the piece where the second of the set of 16th notes doesn't see the top note of the middle 2 being repeated. Now to complete the piece, all we've got left is the ending. It uses the main pattern over a single D minor chord that moves through its inversions. We can also notice that the bass line descends through 2 octaves of a D minor arpeggio in root position. The split between the hands is that the right hand actually takes the first two of their 16th note set and the left hand takes the next two. And this is our last exception that proves the rule. In every case, the second 16th note is a single note, with the third being a two-note chord or a dyad, where the top note, as usual, remains the same. And at the end, don't be afraid to bring out the bass here if you wish, and perhaps different elements of the 16th note pattern. Now, whilst I've gone through this tutorial from beginning to end of the piece, if you like, when you learn it, I'd actually recommend doing it slightly differently. I'd start off with the beginning bits, so say the first 8 measures, work through those, get nice and comfortable with the patterns so that your brain starts to understand exactly what's going on. But then, rather than keep moving forward, go to the end and start working backwards. Now, it might seem a little odd, but I found it really, I don't know, it's perhaps just psychological, but when you've been practicing from the end of something, when you come to perform it, you always feel that you're moving forward towards more familiar music because you've practiced it ever so slightly longer in elapsed time, if you like. And that can help stave off a little bit of the usual performance nerves that we get. Anyway, let me know how you get on learning this piece. It's a fantastic piece to learn and I really enjoyed it. And if you're not already, don't forget to subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.